Hello and welcome to Writing with Steve. In this video we explore Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, a poem that perfectly captures her genius and quirky singular style. I will examine the poem's techniques, its themes and the poet's style, and I'll be providing a stanza by stanza summary. Like all the videos I post, they are aimed at those interested in writing and literature and students preparing for an assignment or an exam. Before we start, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, it would be great if you would. It costs nothing to subscribe and keeps the channel running. Many thanks. I have the poem here. Let's start. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labour and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Because I Could Not Stop for Death explores both the inevitability of death and the uncertainties surrounding what happens when we die. In the poem, the speaker recounts the day she died and her meeting with death. The poem has one of the most intriguing opening lines in literature. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Doesn't it make you want to read on and learn more? In line 1, the speaker says she could not stop for death, but death, like a supernatural cabman, drew up in a horse-drawn carriage and invited her to join him on a journey. We later learn her destination is a grave or tomb. Most likely this relates to how most people do not choose to die but have death thrust upon them. Perhaps Dickinson is using kindly ironically here. Or is she sincere? The beauty of this poem is that we are left to form our own opinions. The poem's matter-of-fact tone, which underplays the fantastical nature of what is happening, quickly establishes this journey as something beyond the speaker's control. It's not clear if the speaker is already dead or she is travelling towards death. Either way, her death is presented as something natural, strange, and inescapable. The personification of death as a man makes the image concrete. Unlike typical depictions, death is not horrific, but kindly, courteous, and civil. Quite charming, really. Dickinson offers no physical description of death and leaves us to imagine him. We conclude he is attractive and kind. After all, if he were the typical depiction, wearing a black cowl, a skull for a face, and hauling around a scythe, would she have voluntarily climbed in? I think not. Therefore, the poem subverts typical notions of death and its appearance. However, it still feels that death has ensnared, trapped her. But more of this later. The carriage is symbolic. It transports the speaker to her final destination. The carriage held but just ourselves. Just ourselves suggests death's undivided attention, makes the speaker feel special, the centre of attention, because death has reserved this ride just for the two of them. In line 4, she mentions immortality. Suppose we believe the poet is using personification. In that case, this implies another in the cab, immortality. But Dickinson is likely capitalising the word to emphasise its importance, that her destination is immortality, an afterlife. Dickinson often capitalises words to stress their importance. It is part of her signature style. There is a darker implication to the carriage ride. What she terms a carriage may be, in fact, an ornate horse-drawn hearse, the type typical in Victorian times, and she is being naive, unaware that this is an abduction rather than an invitation. Perhaps she uses carriage as a euphemism for a hearse because the thought of riding in a hearse is too distressing to contemplate. Alternatively, Dickinson depicts a benign, kindly death who wants her journey to the grave to be anxiety-free, leisurely, and pleasurable. The caesura, a natural break or stop in the poem's flow, at the end of line 4, stresses the ending of her life, a boundary between life and death. The second stanza focuses on her unhurried journey with her new companion, death. On line 5, we slowly drove, he knew no haste. Here, assonance is used. The elongated vowel sounds O and A make us read this line slowly, to take our time and to contemplate the speaker's slow journey to the grave. The use of assonance also complements this slow journey. Again, the poem subverts the typical representation of death, whisking us away. Here, death allows her to savour her final moments in the land of the living. It implies that death works to a different time scale and has time on his side, because he is not time's slave. Unlike human life, which is finite and lived in a relatively short period, death operates outside of time. Dickinson uses dark humour to great effect. And I had put away my labour and my leisure too, for his civility. Labour and leisure. Here, antithesis emphasises death's finality. Death is universal and complete. There is no longer a need to work or relax. These opposites link further through alliteration, the repetition of the L sound. And by now, it appears the speaker is captivated by Death's charm. She gives him her undivided attention because he is civil, kind and considerate towards her. Yet throughout the poem, we must decide if Death's civility is sincere or a ploy to conceal he has her trapped. Civility is likely a pun, a play on a word, or a loaded word full of different associations. Here Dickinson could be alluding to, referencing the American Civil War, but more on that later. In stanza 3, this ride takes the speaker past symbols of the different stages of her life. Her childhood symbolized by a school, her growing and maturing symbolized by grain stalks, and her decline and death symbolized by a sunset. At the end of lines 10, 11 and 12, Caesura marks these stages. First, the carriage passes a school where children play during recess, break time. They have formed a circle at recess in the ring. Here, juxtaposition contrasts the children beginning their lives with the speaker nearing her end. Strove reminds us of the labour she refers to earlier. The children will return to their schoolwork in readiness for the world of work that awaits them. In contrast, the speaker's toil is over. These lines now guide us to re-examine the opening line, because I could not stop for death. Now it takes a new significance. She was always too busy to stop for anything, but death will stop for us. Was all her busyness and work worth it in retrospect? Should she have stopped and spent more time in the leisure she fleetingly refers to on line 7? The ring may allude, reference, to the circle of life, and that birth and death are part of our rites of passage. The speaker passes fields of gazing grain. Personification makes them seem like spectators watching her carriage pass by. Grain reminds us of harvesting, that eventually the grain must be harvested. Death is harvesting the speaker. And through association, the line alludes to death as the grim reaper who harvests the living with his sickle or scythe. Fields suggest the Elysium fields the Romans believed the dead go, an afterlife portrayed in the film Gladiator. The reference to the setting sun symbolizes the ending of the day and is the speaker's last day on earth. It is a poignant moment in the poem. The sun, another circle, the Earth's orbit, and the other school children's circle allude once more to the life cycle. The sun measures temporal time, but soon she will be free of solar days, the time-governed world. Stanza 4 is the poem's turning point, or volta. With the sun's departure, the speaker's world is chill. On line 13, or rather, he passed us, personification is used, the sun passing her and death, and introduces an otherworldly feeling, where the laws of science and temporal time no longer operate. Anaphora, the repetition of we past coupled with assonance, stresses the speaker's recollection of how the day remains fresh in her memory, although we later learn centuries have passed. The repetition of past reminds us of her passing and puns on the past. Her former life is over and is now the past. What starts as a pleasant carriage ride becomes a fearful passage to the land of the dead. Line 14 is the poem's turning point, when she is cast into a chill world at the sun's departure. Cold is associated with death. The personification of quivering grass stresses extreme cold, but quivering also suggests fear. She is afraid, perhaps at the realization she has crossed the threshold into the realm of the dead. She is inappropriately dressed. Her clothing is lightweight. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. These details suggest the speaker's vulnerability and unpreparedness for this significant change. Gossamer and tulle are light materials. A tippet is a cape or scarf. However, it is also a ceremonial scarf and perhaps something for decoration rather than for practical use. It cannot fend off the cold. These clothes and the decorative scarf suggest she is wearing a shroud or funeral dress. Gossamer and tippet are words associated with entrapment. A tippet is also a fishing line, so this word suggests death has hooked and caught her. Gossamer is a lightweight material, but it is also what spiders weave to form a web. Therefore, like a spider, death has caught his prey. She is like a fly caught in a spider's web. Like a predator, death lured her to follow him, and his civility was no more than a trick. Gossamer may suggest lightness, a material light as air. It suggests she is losing her earthly substance, dematerializing, floating. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. In stanza 5, the carriage halts outside what she euphemistically terms a house. No more than a swelling of the ground. This swelling is her tomb or grave, her final resting place. Notably, swelling contains the idea of birth. She is born into death, part of a life-death cycle. Everything is reversed in the land of the dead. Her house, a representation of everyday domestic living, literally disappears into the ground and marks the end of her final connection with life and the everyday world. The placement of the phrase "in the ground" in line 20 makes her journey even more final, as though the phrase has been buried at the end of the stanza. Reference to a roof and cornice in the ground suggests this is her new home. for eternity. These euphemisms conceal the sinister thought that she is to be interred or buried. It is as though she can't bear the thought of calling it a grave or tomb. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. This final stanza creates a jolt. While the poem uses the past tense, the final stanza changes. While the poem is mostly written in the past tense, the final stanza changes tense and pushes us to the speaker's present. The ending is intensely ambiguous and mysterious, as Dickinson's poems, especially those about death, so often are. In the final stanza, we learn that she has been dead for centuries, but hundreds of years feel shorter than the day she passed over. We surmise this because she is outside of the temporal world, outside time, and governed by different laws. At the poem's end, we learn that although death's surface charm seduced her to follow him, she had suspected that their journey was to eternity. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Let's now examine the poem's themes and significant technical features. A significant theme is death and the afterlife. Dickinson presents an afterlife which forces us to ponder, would I enjoy her version of the afterlife? And what type of afterlife, assuming there is one, would I favour? It's in large part this inconclusiveness that makes the poem so powerful. Emily Dickinson and her contemporaries were accustomed to death being visible within society. Unlike today, people mostly died at home and remained there until the funeral day, when family members or an undertaker collected the body and took it to the cemetery. Although commonplace, Dickinson had a particular curiosity about death. She wrote other poems where she speculated what it would be like, or if there was an afterlife. Dickinson is equally curious about the rituals surrounding death in a small town like Amherst, where she lived. Dickinson's preoccupation with what happens after death is exemplified in her poem I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, where she imagines a dead woman speaking to her amid the buzz of a fly. Emily Dickinson enjoyed a privileged education, was exceptionally well read, and was fiercely curious about anatomy and science. This poem reflects her interest in transitions between the physical and metaphysical spheres, meaning the material, physical world and what lies beyond. Interestingly, her poem is not religious, despite references to an existence after death. There's no mention of heaven or hell, God or angels. The speaker exists somewhere and has retained memories of her former life, particularly of the day she died. Another theme is the cyclical nature of existence. Dickinson presents life as a journey. The speaker's observations along this journey reinforce the idea that life and death are in a cyclical balance. In a way, the poem suggests life is impossible without death. Dickinson references our rites of passage and represents these through symbols: childhood, school, adulthood and reproduction, the growing grain stalks, and death, sunset. Symbols represent life's cyclical nature, the ring of children, the sun, and even death's carriage wheels turning towards their final destination. We can also examine the poem as a political statement. Dickinson wrote it around 1863, while her country was in its third year of civil war, where death occurred on a mass scale. Amherst, Dickinson's town, did not escape the war's reach, suffering many casualties and deaths, and Dickinson knew personally many of her community's Civil War dead. Exploring the poem in its historical context, a torn nation and civil strife, civility is used pejoratively, negatively. Civility is a pun on civil, the Civil War. Perhaps her reference to civility and charm is aimed at the smooth-talking politicians who have seduced the men to enlist. Death, rather than leisurely, during the war, is brutal and performative, going about his business without time to spare. Therefore, the unique, leisurely attention he gives the poem's speaker starkly contrasts with the broader canvas of the war. Dickinson is likely being ironic that death could not, in reality, devote so much attention to one life when he is taking men, women, and children in their thousands. Yet also, despite death being a universal phenomenon, we will experience it on our terms. Like the poem's speaker, it will be an experience unique to ourselves. This paradox lies at the poem's heart, making it powerful and profound. We have Emily Dickinson's signature punctuation, including the capitalization of specific nouns to emphasize words or ideas, and her trademark dashes. This poem is full of Emily Dickinson's dark humour. It's wry and witty. The poem is ambiguous. It suggests that the speaker surmised, guessed, death was tricking her into following him, that she had seen through his charms and guessed what he was doing, but could not escape. Pure seduction. She could not stop for him, meaning she did not voluntarily choose the journey. We are unsure if she likes her new home, where she is now. The poem's conclusion suggests an acceptance that death comes to us all. Of course, she says that the afterlife and centuries passed quickly may suggest that the afterlife is not at all dull. Although she does not mention activities, there is the suggestion that she is incorporeal, without form or substance. Emily Dickinson's poems in many ways resemble William Blake's because they retain many of the features of a ballad or hymn and have a simplicity of style while examining profound ideas. Like Blake, her poems are eccentric with her trademark capitalization and dashes. The poem's form is typical of Dickinson's poems. It comprises 6 quatrains with a regular sense of metre and rhyme that gives the poem a forward momentum, fitting the idea of a journey. Each stanza in this poem functions as a distinct stage in the speaker's symbolic journey. This clear-cut form helps convey how simple descriptions and images can capture the mysterious journey from life to death. That is, the clarity of the poem's form helps capture the mysteriousness of its content. Like Dickinson's I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, the poem starts with a clear opening statement that seems to come from the speaker's past before the main events of the poem unfold. In the poem's final stanza, we reach the speaker's present, in which she seems to speak from beyond the grave, thus ending in an atmosphere of mystery and uncertainty. Many of her poems contain 8, then 6 stressed and unstressed syllables. This poem has an irregular rhythm, especially in stanza 4, which mimics natural speech and introduces a feeling that everything is not as it seems on the surface. Perhaps death is not as charming as he appears. Because I could not stop for death is written in metre, meaning the lines comprise feet with 2 syllables in an unstressed, stressed pattern. Mostly the poem alternates between tetrameter, 4 iambs per line, and trimeter, 3 iambs per line. The third stanza is a good example of this. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. This particular metrical form is sometimes called common metre, often found in ballad stanzas and church hymns. Using a stanza reminiscent of church hymns subtly places the poem within a religious context, meaning that its considerations of death seem to examine whether there is a Christian afterlife. Line 14 contains an interesting metrical variation. Whereas usually the metrical scheme would demand a line of iambic trimeter or iambic trimeter, this line packs in a few more syllables, gaining an extra foot. The dews drew quivering and chill. This makes it seem like a chill runs throughout the line, briefly making it shiver and waver away from the usual metrical scheme. Because I could not stop for death aligns with the form I've just discussed. This runs A, B, C, B. The poem is propelled by the expectation of rhyme, conveying the rhythm and momentum of the speaker's journey with death. That said, Dickinson resists making the rhymes too clear or satisfying to the ear, opting in most cases for away and civility, almost rhyme but not quite. This refusal to use complete rhymes helps build the poem's sense of disquiet and mystery. The reader can sense that there is a rhyme scheme, but to a degree it is hidden, like the answer to the question at the heart of the poem: what happens when people die? The rhyme scheme is elusive. One interesting moment occurs in the penultimate stanza. The poem uses the same word twice, rhyming ground with ground again. It emphasizes the earthiness of what happens to be the speaker's final bodily resting place, her own grave. The first person voice makes the poem conversational, as if she shares intimate details of the afterlife with us. Dickinson's rhyme makes the poem mimic a hymn, fitting for a poem focused on the afterlife. But rhyme also helps us remember the important ideas she examines. Enjambment, run-on lines, mimics the natural flow of speech, reinforced by caesura, that mimics how we often stop mid-sentence or pause for breath. Consonance plays a steady and subtle role throughout the poem. For instance, line 3 combines consonant L sounds with the assonance of E sounds in held and ourselves. These sounds give the sense of death's tightening grip on his prey. It is a moment in which the sound of the line feels extremely deliberate, as though it had to be that way. Death would collect the speaker whether or not she wants this. Another example of consonance occurs in lines 21 to 23. Here, S sounds are abundant. Sibilance. These lend the ending a ghostly and whisper-like quality. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads. Born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson is celebrated as one of the greatest American poets. Yet there was little sign of that in her lifetime. People in Amherst knew her more for being reclusive than a talented poet. Only 11 poems were published in her lifetime, and of these, 10 were published against her wishes. She never married. It is unlikely she had real-world experience of romance. She had few friends except for her siblings and her sister-in-law. She travelled once to Washington, D.C., but exchanged passionately devoted letters to people she met only a few times. She generally conducted what friendship she had through the pen rather than in person. The last 15 years of her life, so from age 40, she hardly left her house and was rarely seen by anyone. She corresponded widely, bringing society and ideas into the room she scarcely left. The few visitors who visited Dickinson found that they had to speak to her on opposite sides of a closed door. Only after she died in 1886, aged 55, came the discovery of her mass of work, almost 1,800 poems, sewn together in neat bundles. Her poems began to be published and quickly gained popularity and critical acclaim, entering the Western literary canon, where they remain today. Because I Could Not Stop for Death is a wonderful entry-level poem for someone new to Emily Dickinson's work. The poem influenced other artists and art mediums, notably the American composer John Adams, who set it to his 1981 orchestral work, Harmonium. Books and films portray death as attractive and charming. For example, Death Takes a Holiday and Meet Joe Black. For more information about Emily Dickinson's life and influences, please watch my other videos of her poems, including Hope is the Thing with Feathers, A Slash of Blue, tell all the truth but tell it slant, and the brain is wider than the sky. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful and interesting. Please check out my other videos on analysis and creative writing. If you haven't yet subscribed, it would be greatly appreciated if you would. Thank you. Until next time, write well.